welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us today from across the globe. So the vast, underprotected, legally complex ocean is 70% of our planet, and that sustains life, defines identity, and it anchors the economies and cultures of billions of people, most especially for small island developing states, or as many prefer to be called, large ocean states. The BBNJ Treaty aims to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. And today we're going to talk about the legal innovations covering the remaining 70% that should also be addressed. The rules governing the high seas, the spaces beyond national jurisdiction, were not designed for your coastlines, your fisheries, or your futures in mind. Species are vanishing, genetic diversity is eroding, and the 30 by 30 target, however important, does not address what happens to the other 70%. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 4, set a bold ambition: halt species extinction, protect genetic diversity, and manage human-wildlife conflict. Today, we're going to cut through the complexity. We will explore the other tools for ocean governance and why two emerging legal concepts, ecocide law and ocean rights, could fundamentally reshape how the ocean is protected. Because local action alone cannot save a migratory species. Bold, systemic legal tools are needed, and that is exactly what we're here to discuss today. This webinar is co-hosted by Stop Ecocide International and the Gallifrey Foundation, of which I am the co-founder, and I'm honored to introduce the extraordinary speakers who will guide us through this landscape today. Let's start first with Guillermo Ortuño Crespo. He's our first speaker and someone who has dedicated his career to the science that makes better ocean law possible. Guillermo holds an MSc in Ecosystem-Based Management and Marine Systems from the University of St. Andrews and a doctorate in Marine Science and Conservation from Duke University, where his research tackled some of the hardest problems in the high seas fisheries governance. He's been deeply involved in the negotiations for the BBNJ Treaty, producing over a dozen research briefs and articles to inform parties on ecological connectivity and spatial management. He now works as an independent scientific consultant and is one of the co-leads of the IUCN WCPA High Seas Specialist Group, the body working to advance area-based management tools under the new treaty. So welcome, Guillermo.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Antoinette, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. As Antoinette said, my name is Guillermo. I'm a marine ecologist by training, and I've specialized in spatial ecology. I'm part of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and through that position, I spend most of my time talking about spatial protection, connectivity, MPA networks, representativity, and whatnot. But I think for today's talk, I'm going to switch gears, and I think the fact that we're talking about the other 70% of the ocean, which is not for which we don't have a spatial management strategy. We are not planning to protect with spatial management measures that other 70. Is perhaps more important than what I've dedicated my life to, which is designing spatial management tools. So in my short interventions, what I want to do is set the scene for the biodiversity crisis we have in the ocean and try to switch the focus a little bit from the focus of my career, which is spatial management, to something that I think is a bit more important, linked to how do we stop the growing biodiversity crisis in the ocean. So this is a new slide deck for me, so indulge me if there's a few hiccups. But I thought I'd start by showing you all the graphs and figures that I'm going to show you in my presentation. As a scientist, this is my love language. This is how I express myself. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the next 10 minutes of the presentation. Some of the figures you may recognize, others you perhaps do not. Some of you may recognize these stripes. We're more familiar with the climate stripes, but these stripes, called global biodiversity stripes, were generated by WWF, and it's a depiction of the global vertebrate population decline that WWF documented from 1970 to 2016. And it shows essentially, at least in my view, the biodiversity crisis that we're in. It's a bit focused on vertebrate populations, so I thought I'd complement that with other very drastic declines in different species groups. We have freshwater species, migratory freshwater fish, oceanic sharks and rays, marine vertebrates. Something that is very scary, flying insects biomass, all the terrestrial biodiversity and wild animal biomass on land is also declining globally. And it's sometimes a silent crisis, and especially in the ocean, because when you look, when you're flying over the ocean, you look out of your airplane window, whether you're looking at a living ocean or a dead ocean, it might look very much the same. But this is what's happening in our lifetime. We are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction in the planet, and that is not, as an ecologist, that is not something easy to say, because it puts a sense of urgency to our work that is not where we would want to be. This biodiversity crisis is, as an ecologist myself, this is something that we have to look at a population level. This decline is happening not a species at a time, but at one population at a time. I'm calling from Costa Rica this morning, and just 5 hours away from here by car, we have the largest leatherback sea turtle nesting beach in the whole Eastern Pacific Ocean. It used to be the home of nesting leatherback sea turtles. Back in 1989, when one of my brothers was born, up to 1,500 females would make it their way to Playa Grande to lay their eggs. I've got colleagues who've been monitoring that beach for a few decades, and they recently finished the program because there are no more leatherback sea turtles arriving. So that is one population out of 7 of one species, but that population is pretty much gone, and it's expected to go extinct by 2040, completely extinct. So this crisis is not is silent because it happens at local, sometimes regional scales. And like Antoinette said in the introduction, many of these species are transboundary, and it's really difficult to track their decline across many countries at the same time. One group of species that in theory, as humans, we're better at tracking their status are global fisheries. This is a graph from the United Nations Food and Agriculture program. They publish a report every 2 years called the Sophia Report, State of the World Fisheries and Agriculture. And this particular figure, figure 1, shows global agriculture production, but in the light blue, you see capture fisheries. What have we been catching in the ocean? And our capture fisheries peaked in 1996. So 30 years ago, we caught the most that we've ever caught in the open ocean. Oh, sorry, in the ocean at large, including coastal areas. And a non-expert, by looking at this figure, could say, well, that looks pretty good because it's been stable since 1996. So we're doing okay. But the story, unfortunately, is a little bit more complex, and I'll show you 2 ways in which that's the case. On the first hand, this is the official data that FAO has that countries contribute to it. This figure in the top right is a reconstruction of fisheries catches by a group called Sea Around Us at the University of British Columbia. And they estimate that the real catch in the ocean of marine capture fisheries might be up to 30% higher of the declared. So this might be an underestimate of how much we've been fishing the ocean. And perhaps more importantly, and it's a little bit nerdy, but bear with me. If you look at this point in time, 1996, yes, catches had been stable, but our fishing effort, and if you look at this dark black line, our effective fishing effort has increased. So what does this mean? We're catching the same, even though we're fishing harder. So if you're fishing harder and harder, you're not catching more, that means the catch and the biomass in the ocean is actually declining. A different graph that is published in these reports is one looking at the population assessment. They call them stocks in fisheries lingo. How are fish populations doing? And something that the UN has been telling us since the mid-70s is that the number of, here in orange, overfished fish populations has been increasing almost uninterruptedly since 1974 to the latest report. When the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, the SDG agenda, was established in 2015, global overfishing was at 33.1%. Target 14.4 in this agenda aimed to finish overfishing by 2020, right here. And instead of the finishing or ending overfishing, the latest estimate of overfishing is that it has not been reduced, but climbed to 37.7% globally. Again, citing some different colleagues at the University of British Columbia, they estimate that this is also an underestimate by the UN. This is a different graph that you would not recognize because I only made it yesterday evening, but I looked at Google Scholar. It's a database of peer-reviewed literature and other reports, and I was curious to see how many times marine or ocean extinction showed up in articles published in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. And as you can see, this topic is gaining unfortunately more momentum in the academic literature. It is a crisis that I think we're deeply immersed in. I think beyond, we're deeper than we even think we are, in my opinion. So over the past, I would say 60 or so years, 50 or 60, we've been developing a lot of international bodies under the UN. This is a figure showing all the architecture of institutions, multilateral bodies, frameworks, treaties that we've developed under the UN to preserve and conserve ocean life. So why is it that despite all of this work, we are seeing these declines accelerate? I don't have the answer. There's no silver bullet, but I do think that sometimes our focus is a little bit misplaced in terms of what the priority should be. And I'm going to zoom into the Convention of Biological Diversity here, the CBD, and you might recognize this logo, as Antoinette mentioned in the intro. This is from the 2022 Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which set a series of international targets to halt biodiversity loss. So the GBF is a global agreement, is again under the CBD, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 through 23 targets. And these should be accomplished while ensuring sustainable use, restoring ecosystems, sharing benefits, aligning finance, and respecting indigenous rights. And yesterday I made the mistake of going on ChatGPT and asking ChatGPT the following question. If you had to pick the single most important target out of the 23, one that has to be met and is keystone to the rest, which one would it be? I told it not to reason with me. Don't say you can't pick, just give me a single target. And it gave me target 3 here in the top left. Target 3 you might all recognize. It is the most popular. It is the one that calls on us to conserve 30% of land, waters, and seas. I asked a follow-up question. Does this answer reflect the general body of literature and frequency with which this specific target is published on? Meaning, is that answer biased because we have published just so much more on target 3? And it said mostly yes. Again, I'm a spatial ecologist. I believe in 30 by 30. I've dedicated my career to it. But I think there's another target that is so much more important than target 3, because target 3 is a tool. And I think it's a tool to help us reach target 4, which Antoinette introduced. And this is the big target from my perspective of the GBF, to halt species extinction, protect genetic diversity, and manage human-wildlife conflicts. And in my experience, I've never or rarely heard people talk about this target. We default to the numeric target 30 by 30 because that's, in my opinion, easier to quantify and unfortunately sometimes feel good about. But I think we're missing the point by not talking about target 4. One of the headline indicators, and I'm almost done, one of the headline indicators for this target 4 is the IUCN Red List. And as I mentioned, I am part of the IUCN sort of community through one of the commissions. And the Commission on Species Survival created the IUCN Red List, which you may recognize. And this is the Convention on Biological Diversity uses the IUCN Red List as an indicator. It is a compilation of species ecological status. It tries to classify different species and sometimes populations into different threat categories. But just to give you a sense of how little we know despite their fantastic work, the IUCN Red List has conducted assessments for almost 20,000 species. And again, a lot of the experts do it on their own time and they're fantastic at what they do. But almost 20,000 species out of the 250,000 species that we've documented in the ocean is less than 10%. And if you then look at how many species we believe inhabit the ocean, it is less than 1% of the species that we're monitoring. So my concern is not our ability to track a few species. It's the unknown unknowns, the species that we're losing before even describing or assessing, that is the big crisis of our time, and one that I don't think that can be addressed solely by meeting target 3. My challenge to our community would be to think about this figure. As an ecologist, the population size, I'll tell you that it matters based on the birth in the population and the deaths, and that has an immigration and migration have some bearing on that. But the deaths in a population, the anthropogenic deaths, is the one topic that we need to address head on. Of course, we have MPAs and OECMs and this 30 by 30 target, and that is a great way of limiting some of that mortality. But my concern is that the mortality in that quote unquote other 70%, if it's left unchecked, if we don't have bycatch limits, if we don't have ship strike death limits of cetaceans, if we don't put hard legal limits and give rights to this biodiversity outside of that 30%, the whole system will be compromised. So my challenge to our community and myself would be to think beyond that 30%. And to also break some paradigms and not assume that all human activities are sustainable. And I don't want to pick on any one country or any one activity, but I just wanted to leave you with this final example. This is a paper that was published in 2021 of artisanal fishing in Sri Lanka, a country that I'll actually be flying to in 2 months, and I'm very excited. But this paper reflected the amount of the impact they have on mobilids, mantas and rays in the ocean. And they estimated that the artisanal fishing alone in Sri Lanka kills more manta rays than the combined tuna purseine fleet around the globe annually. So one artisanal activity in one island nation can have more of an environmental impact than the whole industrial fleet. I'm not blue washing industrial activities. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, I don't particularly mind if it's industrial or artisanal. We have to look at how many animals are dying and put a limit to that mortality throughout their entire range. So to leave you with some concluding thoughts, I think we have to do a much, much better job at quantifying marine populations, how many animals are left by population. Once we have a better understanding of that, we need to set limits, and those limits have to apply to all human sectors. Once we have those limits, those have to be distributed equitably, and it has to be grounded in environmental and blue justice to make sure that everyone has a fair access to that biodiversity. We also have to track cumulative impacts. It's not good enough if we just look at one stressor. We have to look at all stressors. As a fisheries person, I think it's time to set bycatch limits. We can't continue using non-selective gears like bottom trawling in the ocean, and we can't not have limits on how many non-target species we kill. And all of this, I think, as I'm not a legal expert, but some of the colleagues on the call are, I think can be enabled by more legal innovation. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I went a little bit over, and I'll hand the floor back to Antoinette.
Thanks so much, and thank you for a very interesting talk. So I couldn't stop you, although I really needed to, so my bad. But really important about limiting mortality, total mortality. Our next speaker is Sue Miller, Chief Network and Alliances Officer from Stop Ecocide She is someone who generally does everything a movement needs. I know this. Seeds ideas, builds bridges, and makes sure no community is left out of the conversation. I think the global organization was co-founded by the late pioneering barrister Polly Higgins and the current CEO Jojo Mehta, and it sits at the very heart of the movement to make ecocide an international crime. Her role is so distinctive, and it takes the concept of ecocide law into every community possible. She is, in the truest sense, the connective tissue of a global movement, and I'd love you to describe ecocide to us, Sue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antoinette. And having listened to Guillermo talking about the catastrophic decline in marine biomass and biodiversity is profoundly worrying. And it helps us to see really clearly that there's an urgent need for much better ocean governance. And that's what I want to talk about today. So we understand what's happening in the ocean and what's driving biomass and biodiversity loss, but still the most serious harm continues. And it's not because of a lack of knowledge, it's because it's a lack of consequences. So the question I want to look at is what happens when damage to the ocean is not just unsustainable, which clearly is, but when it's unacceptable, when the law comes into play and makes it unacceptable. Because what we're looking at is an ecological crisis in the ocean, which has been enabled by a legal gap. Now, the ocean's already governed by a complex legal architecture. I was going to create a slide to illustrate how fragmented ocean governance is, but Guillermo has done it better than I ever could. I don't know if you can share your slide again, Guillermo, because it is amazing. As you can see, it's complicated. It's fragmented. As a framework, it's weak, and it's in large part either unenforced or unenforceable. So the sort of foundation of the framework is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that establishes jurisdictional zones and sets out the rights and duties of states. It also creates a general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. But critically, it has no enforcement mechanism, and it relies on states to regulate the areas within their jurisdiction. In addition to that, we've got a growing network of agreements and mechanisms, such as the regional fisheries management organisations, marine protected areas, and most recently, the BBNJ Agreement. And at that, the BBNJ Agreement is a really major step forward in supporting conservation in the high seas, but again, has no provision for effective enforcement. Alongside these, we've got the global commitments such as SDG 14 and the GBF, in particular, the targets which Guillermo referred to, target 3, which is the 30 by 30, and target 4 on halting extinction. Lots more. And it's a really substantial framework, but it's built largely around cooperation, management, and negotiated limits. And it tells us how we can use the ocean, but it's much less clear about what we can't do in the ocean. And the sad truth is that without setting clear boundaries, economic interests will always trump conservation. In most areas of law, when harm reaches a certain threshold, we move beyond regulation and we prohibit it and we criminalize it. And in the ocean, particularly in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, that threshold is not clearly defined. And it means that activities, even if they cause severe ecosystem damage, may still be lawful. And even if they're unlawful, the enforcement is weak and issues can fall between jurisdictions. So we can negotiate fishing quotas, we can designate protected areas, and we can agree environmental impact assessments, but we don't yet have a clear rule that says a certain level of harm is unacceptable. Very few people whose livelihoods come from the ocean or whose waste ends up in the ocean, whether they're artisanal fishermen, soft drinks producers, massive fishing conglomerates, set out to deliberately damage the ocean. It's just an unfortunate side effect of their commercial activity. And it happens because there's no discernible downside or disincentive. And that's the gap ecocide law is designed to fill. So what does it do? Put simply, it introduces a legal threshold beyond which environmental harm is no longer acceptable. This is the definition that was formulated by an independent panel of experts convened by our sister foundation, Stop Ecocide Foundation, and launched in 2021. And it says that ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Ecocide law doesn't replace existing laws or regulation. What it does is it sits above and around it, and it supports and strengthens what's already there. It's not about managing the everyday use of the ocean, but it's about addressing the most serious forms of harm and the acts which lead to the large-scale ecosystem destruction and irreversible biodiversity loss. And its power is that it introduces personal criminal liability for the key decision makers behind the ecocidal acts. And that changes behaviour, because when risk moves from the balance sheet, where fines or penalties for damage become a business expense, and it moves to the directors themselves, that changes the decision-making process. And the question that they have to ask themselves is not what level of harm is acceptable, can we get away with it under this permit, to does this activity cross a line that should never be crossed? And ecocide law covers the entirety of the earth, but it's especially important for the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdiction where governance is particularly weak. And it works in a number of ways. First, it creates a global standard. It's not dependent on any single jurisdiction. The threshold is one of gravity, which is the seriousness of the damage and not whether the act appears on a list of prohibited acts. Lists don't age well, and they invite people to find gaps to exploit. Second, it acts as a deterrent, and it does this by targeting the most serious conduct rather than trying to regulate everything. Third, it closes accountability gaps by focusing not on corporations, but on the actual individuals making the decisions that carry known risks of severe harm. And there's another important aspect to ecocide law, and that is that it polices the precautionary principle. There are currently numerous technologies being developed, some of which are ostensibly to help mitigate or adapt to climate change, things like geoengineering, solar radiation modification, or synthetic biology. And the problem is that with any new technology, and we've seen it with social media, for example, very recently, regulation is always playing catch up. And to misquote Winston Churchill, a new technology can be halfway around the world before regulation has got its boots on. What ecocide does is sets a clear line in advance so that those who take a decision to release new technologies will be committing ecocide if that technology causes or is likely to cause either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. So instead of simply managing activities within the ocean, ecocide law begins to define and enforce ecological red lines. And in so doing, it also ushers in a shift in consciousness about what we as humanity deem acceptable. Now, the good news is that the momentum is behind us, and it's on its way. It's no longer just a theoretical idea, and we're seeing real movement across multiple legal systems. Belgium has already introduced an ecocide law based on the IEP definition, and 15 other countries currently have ecocide bills or proposals going through their legislatures. I'm going to do a list here. They include countries as diverse as Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Azerbaijan, India, Philippines, Turkey, Dominican Republic, French Polynesia. There are more. At regional level, the EU has adopted a revised and strengthened environmental crime directive, and that includes a new qualified offence, which it calls crimes comparable to ecocide, and that comes with significantly enhanced criminal penalties. And at the international level, 3 critically threatened small island states, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, have formally proposed the independent expert definition of ecocide as an amendment to the Rome Statute, which is the founding document of the International Criminal Court. So it's now on the agenda of the ICC's Working Group on Amendments. Once adopted, and we always say when it's adopted and not if, it will sit alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression as the 5th crime against peace. In the meantime, there's also movement within the ICC itself. The Office of the Prosecutor has indicated that it will have a closer focus on environmental elements which might aggravate those 4 existing crimes. And in addition to this, ecocide is now on the agenda of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment for the 25 to 27 period. And last October, the IUCN Members' Assembly adopted a motion supporting and recognising the need to advance ecocide law. So what we're seeing is a clear convergence of national, regional and international legal systems towards recognising that the most serious environmental harm must carry consequences. For developing island states and coastal communities, this has got particular importance because their food security, their livelihoods, culture, and sometimes their very existence is threatened by environmental damage, which usually originates very far beyond their national waters and is driven by those with far greater economic power. So ecocide law helps to address that balance, and it creates a mechanism through which those who are most responsible for severe harm can be held accountable. So in conclusion, I'd say that until now, we've treated the ocean as something to be managed using regulation to try and limit the collateral damage caused by commercial exploitation. But it's not working. Regulation alone can't deal with destruction at the levels that we're seeing. And at some point, you've got to draw a line. And ecocide is about drawing that line clearly, enforceably, and internationally. And it's about making a statement that the most serious harm to the ocean can no longer be tolerated. And it's about shifting the dial on what we as humanity find acceptable. And there's just one other slide I'd like to share with you because it's quite colourful and impressive. So that's the global momentum. So if you see pre-2016, there was, and there were a number of old ecocide laws within the former Soviet states, which they brought in when they were drawing up their constitutions after the breakup of the Soviet Russia. SCI was founded in 2017. There was some movements sort of just in the run-up to the definition in 2021, and since then it's kind of exploded, and you can see the level of engagement internationally there.
That's amazing, Sue. Thank you. That's really good. Thank you very much indeed. What is so great is if ecocide is the deterrent, okay, then there is the other side, which is rights. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Michelle Bender is the mother of the ocean, mother of ocean rights, I should say. And it's a movement she created in 2017 when she identified a profound gap in the rights of nature movement, which had transformative potential, but almost no one has been applying it to the ocean specifically. So she has since provided expertise on rights of nature laws and policies from Rhode Island to Panama, the Philippines to Aruba, and has worked towards the recognition of the whales as legal persons. She is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, an expert on UN Harmony with Nature Initiative, and a steering committee member for the UN Ocean Decade. Really looking forward to seeing this other side of the ecocide and rights legal tools. So, Michelle, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining today, and Antoinette, Stop Ecocide, for hosting this webinar and for the introduction. So I want to start by framing where ocean rights comes from and why I feel so strongly in this movement. And the IPBES really describes it quite well in their recent reports on assessing the diverse values of nature. And they share that our environmental responses can largely be framed as single loop learning, where the symptoms are addressed rather than the root cause. So we add new laws, we add new regulations, treaties on top of the ones that are already not being implemented or enforced. Therefore, achieving the protection and preservation of the marine environment requires what is called double loop learning, which means changing and challenging at the foundational level the very values, norms, practices, and institutions that not only created the conditions for the polycrisis to arise in the first place, but actually fuels those problems. And so this is what ocean rights and the moral and legal recognition of the ocean as a living entity with intrinsic value and inherent rights can do. And I will walk through why. First, I want to start by just showing that this isn't something that we're just making up or doesn't exist anywhere yet. It is a part of a larger movement, the Rights in Nature movement, that has hundreds, over 500 laws, policies, judicial decisions, treaty agreements from the local to the international level. We are seeing these laws, these court decisions in approximately 40 countries around the world. But I will say for the ocean, as in sort of every conversation we've had so far, is being left out of the conversation. And as Antoinette shared, that is why I started and really focus on the application of rights in nature within the ocean context, because only approximately 10 to 15% of these examples that we're seeing globally are specific to marine ecosystems and species. So we recently launched the Ocean Rights Movement website, which has a map where we're tracking all these examples internationally, where you can see more, engage with them more. But I just want to highlight a few just so you can get a snapshot. Panama not only has a national rights of nature law, but they subsequently passed a sea turtle conservation law that recognizes sea turtles as a subject of rights, with the right to a healthy environment and free and safe passage. We have a local municipality, Linhares, Brazil, that recognizes the Rio Doce wave ecosystem as a living being with intrinsic value. Antoinette already mentioned, we have an initiative emerging across the Pacific to recognize whales as legal persons, to protect their rights and intrinsic value along their migratory routes. And we're seeing this start to emerge in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as Tonga. And then last year, we actually were involved in drafting and negotiating a resolution to the IUCN on advancing an ethical human-ocean relationship that urges members to recognize and ensure the ocean's intrinsic value, advance the principle of ecological sustainable use, and advance ethical approaches within new or existing international instruments. So now, in order to understand rights in nature, we need to understand rights. What are rights, and therefore what makes rights of nature different from traditional environmental law? Rights are entitlements or interests that an entity holds in which others have duties to respect, protect, and ensure. So for example, human rights are human interests. They can be individual, they can be collective. We have those interests such as life, health, economic development, cultural way of life, a healthy environment. We've also seen with human rights that they apply regardless of where the action is being conducted. Rights are enforceable. Actors can be held accountable for not only infringements and violating rights, but not doing enough to ensure their protection. Rights are seen as the strongest rule we have to guide societal behavior. When we recognize the ocean as a rights-bearing entity, it shifts how we relate, value, and use the marine environment. It shifts us this idea and worldview away from viewing the ocean as a resource, object, property, here for human benefit and utility, to a living, dynamic, and interconnected being with whom we have a relationship with. Ocean rights, importantly, is not just about rights. The recognition of rights is just the first step. We've seen this with human rights, that they must be given legal force and effect through the development of implementation and enforcement mechanisms. For rights of nature, we're seeing these mechanisms take the frame of governance principles, ecocentric principles, such as in dubio pro natura, which is an evolved version of the precautionary principle. Simply put, when in doubt, err on the side of nature, err on the side of the ocean. Pick that alternative that is least harmful to the ocean. We're also seeing the establishment of co-governance or guardianship structures that proactively ensure that the intrinsic values and status of the ecosystem or the species is represented in decision-making affecting its health. So not just retroactively once harm is done and bringing a lawsuit for rights violations, but ensuring that the rights are applied as we are making those decisions. So rights in nature or ocean rights is not just simply new law or environmental law. I like to think about environmental law like a contract. It is a contract we are making between ourselves and the environment for how we are going to treat it. How are we going to protect it? How are we managing our activity, and what standards are we holding that to? Unfortunately, though, as we all have heard, this contract largely benefits the party that drafted it, us. It is anthropocentric, based upon human standards, and political and economic interests can outweigh environmental protection, even though we think environmental law is here to protect the environment. So contrary to what we think. So rights comes into play, and it ensures that this contract, that environmental law, actually benefits and protects the environment, that the ocean's interests are protected, and the ocean is a stakeholder at the table, not just an object or a resource up for discussion. And just to expand upon the difference between ecocide law and ocean rights, as Sue already introduced, ecocide law being criminal law and the punishment of actors for these actions that cause severe environmental harm, and that these actors can be criminally liable for these actions. It deters, it prevents those actions from happening, and therefore it can also help change behavior, right? Ocean rights, on the other hand, changes the system itself. So as I shared, it's not environmental law, but a normative framework because it influences the entire legal order. And the ocean's interests and well-being must be considered integrated and balanced in decision-making and disputes affecting its health. Rights also ensures our understanding of what is significant harm, what is severe harm, is from the ocean's perspective, and doesn't just become a purely political or economic, short-term economic decision. You'll hear both frameworks referred to as two sides of the same coin. This means, for example, just like the crime of murder, one side of the coin prevents infringements to the right to life, the other side. Ecocide can help prevent violations of the ocean's right to life or existence. All right, so now we've covered what rights are, what they do. Digging a little deeper, I want to give you a look at how specifically ocean rights can help us move beyond the standard, 30 by 30 targets that we focus on, namely to achieve target 4, to prevent extinction, protect genetic diversity. The right to exist and life is considered a main right of nature and its components. Now, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach across the laws we're seeing, but this right, I would say, is pretty standard. It's written into most all rights of nature laws that I've seen. This right has both positive and negative substantive elements. So on the one hand, the ocean's right to exist means that the ocean must be able to maintain and regenerate its vital cycles, processes, and functions. On the other hand, existence means, quite simply, the right not to go extinct. So therefore, this right alone requires that activities that may lead to the extinction of species, the destruction of the ecosystems they inhabit, or the permanent alteration of natural cycles should be prohibited. That when there is risk of these situations occurring, precautionary and restrictive measures are a legal obligation. In practice, therefore, respecting and ensuring the ocean's right to exist changes our approach. So instead of focusing on the prevention of damage or aiming to take as much fish or biodiversity out of the system as possible without preventing collapse, which is currently maximum sustainable yield, ocean rights requires decision makers to aim for higher, to not just slow the decline in population health, but to reverse it. So at a minimum, we are to maintain population and ecosystem health, and better yet, restore it. So this legal recognition of the ocean's right to exist can support the effective implementation of the GBF, specifically Target 4. And in fact, rights of nature is already included in this treaty as an implementation measure and target. It recognizes diverse value systems, such as rights of nature, as being an integral part of its successful implementation for those countries that recognize them. So now we just need to move towards not having the clarifier of only for those countries that recognize them, but its broad application. And I want to share a tangible example of what the impact of ocean rights can and already is having on the ground. At the end of 2024, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador delivered a landmark judgment specific to coastal marine ecosystems. Now, Ecuador is currently the first and only country to recognize rights of nature, or Pachamama, as a subject of rights within its constitution. This case involved industry challenging a coastal zoning regulation that reserved use within 8 nautical miles from the shore for purely artisanal fishing. So industrial fishers asserted that this regulation violated their right to economic development. But the court found the opposite, that this regulation was appropriate, necessary, and proportional because it ensured that the rights of coastal marine ecosystems to exist and maintain and regenerate their vital cycles, processes, and functions, and it protected the longevity of the fishing industry so that local community could benefit from healthy fish populations for generations to come. So what specifically does this case tell us about what this means practically? First, the case demonstrates that human activity continues to exist under rights of nature, that it doesn't mean that we stop development, we stop fishing, but that extractive, exploitative activity is subject to regulation in order to prevent disproportionate harm for not only marine life, but for human communities. Second, such a regulation was found to adhere and actually implement the best available science. So prior to the issuance of the regulation, they found that the biomass of small pelagic fish within the 8 nautical mile zone actually decreased by 27% in just 1 year. They also found that the vast majority, nearly 90% of small pelagic fish biomass It's actually located outside of this zone. So this restriction didn't really deprive the industrial fishers of their main fishing grounds, but rather it protected critical spawning areas within the zone where these fish begin and develop their life cycles, allowing them to mature and thrive, which is so necessary in terms of creating or supporting ecosystem health and functioning, not just now, but for future generations. Finally, the court highlighted how rights are not absolute. Human rights and rights in nature, they both can be subject to limitation. In particular, here, though, the court confirmed that the right to economic development is subject to social and environmental responsibility. So this means that the use of the marine environment cannot jeopardize the existence of species or ecosystems, and that such use is in fact subject to a mandate to maintain and ensure not only the welfare of future human generations, but to the conservation of the intrinsic value of nature. So this is a court case, but we can begin to see how decision-making also undergoes this shift by utilizing these arguments, these principles, and these standards. We can see how ocean rights in nature can support the creation of protected areas, enable their strict protection, but go beyond that, to support regulations that prohibit or limit destructive and exploitative activities, and how these standards can be maintained and follow species across their jurisdictional lines that, or imaginary jurisdictional lines that we create that they don't adhere to. So just to end, I want to just highlight and bring attention to this graph and really reiterate, that human health, livelihood, and economic development, they are interconnected and interdependent upon one another. And what we have now is a system that treats these as linked, but still independent. But what ocean rights does, it reorients our systems around the true relationship they have, realizing that we cannot realize our human rights without a healthy environment to support them. So ocean rights can really ensure we listen to science. And this was recently confirmed in the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion on climate change released last year, where they not only found that rights of nature is complementary and interconnected with human rights, but they actually asserted that rights of nature can provide an appropriate framework for states to achieve a truly sustainable development model, one that reconciles economic development with the protection of the environment. So I encourage you to check out that AO if you haven't seen it. Great information on rights of nature. But with that, I'll end my presentation, and feel free to contact me with any questions, comments, concerns.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. So these are really exciting and inspiring tools. But our final speaker is going to bring us from legal theory to legal practice. Vedika Mandapati is a policy analyst at Global Choices, and she leads advocacy for the Central Arctic Ocean Moratorium, one of the high sea's most ecologically critical frontiers. And she's working at the interface of Arctic governance and the BBNJ Treaty. She's done remarkable work taking the recent ITLOS and ICJ and Inter-American Court advisory opinions and applying them directly into IMO shipping negotiations via the Clean Arctic Alliance, and translating that into protections against black carbon and underwater noise with real consequences for species survival. She's proudly an Arctic angel from India. So welcome, Vedika, and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoinette, and everyone else. It's been some really interesting conversations. As Antoinette mentioned, I work with a nonprofit called Global Choices, which is based out of the United States and the United Kingdom, and we have a very specific policy mission of protecting the Central Arctic Ocean, or the CAO. It's the only high seas in the Arctic, and I know we've been looking at really sort of large systems levels conversations today, so I'm not trying to be place-based. In fact, I'm carrying through that same thread of global interconnectedness of our oceans. The frozen ocean often is left out of some conversations around why our oceans are interconnected and how these systems have impacts. And one of the key links here is that sea ice reflects a lot of the sunlight that it encounters rather than allowing it to be absorbed. And so sea ice has very direct ties to ocean warming, which is important not only locally in the Arctic, but around the world. And if we want to look at systems level and sort of tie into something that Sue said about food security, for an example that's close to home, the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean has recently been linked to monsoon patterns in India. And the majority of India's agriculture is monsoon driven. So as wild as that link seems, Arctic sea ice extent has a lot to do with the food security of over 1 billion people in the Indian subcontinent. And we can draw links like that across the world, both in the human world and looking at marine biodiversity, on why it's so important to protect our cryosphere. One of our patrons, Dr. Sylvia Earle, the great Dr. Sylvia Earle, she often says that we know more about what's on the moon than what's under the sea ice. And tying back to something Guillermo said, it's very important to protect even that we don't know. We don't know that much about the marine biodiversity under the Central Arctic Ocean, certainly not as much as we do in parts of the ocean that aren't frozen. That doesn't mean it's not important enough for us to be protecting. So with that systems level global perspective, at Global Choices, we're calling for a precautionary principle pause, a minimum of 10 years of a moratorium on exploitative activities in the Central Arctic Ocean. Now, moratorium is just a legal word for a pause. And it's really important to understand that at the moment, the Central Arctic Ocean is frozen, no commercial scale activity has begun. But given the threats from climate change and the rapidly declining sea ice extent, there is a real danger of increased commercial activity interest there. There's an interest in drilling for oil and gas, which I'm sure everyone in this webinar realizes is, absolutely unnecessary, in mining the deep seabed, in potentially doing geoengineering, and also in shipping across the North Pole, which in theory might mean that if you're getting goods from China or East Asia, they might arrive to Europe or North America slightly faster, but at massive, massive cost ecologically, as well as to most peoples around the world. And so all we're doing is asking for states to come together with voluntary self-regulation and agree to a pause of at least 10 years. So if we zoom back into the Central Arctic Ocean and sort of back to a local perspective, obviously the Arctic Ocean is essential for Arctic indigenous peoples who've stewarded that ecosystem for millennia, who have cultural traditions tied to it, as well as sustenance needs. And if we look at the species and marine biodiversity in the Arctic Ocean, it's actually been pointed out that they are more vulnerable to human or anthropogenic activity because they're not used to it. They haven't had to encounter it at a local level. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council, for example, has provided guidance to the International Maritime Organization that underwater noise in the Arctic Ocean from the sudden increase in shipping as the ice melts is a grave threat to whales and other cetaceans in the Arctic Ocean. So that's on a local level. And you might be asking yourself how exactly you get states to agree to voluntarily self-regulate, and do we really need something else looking at that mind map or that flowchart that we had up on the screen? And our idea is to be slightly creative and look beyond the massive multilateral treaty negotiation processes that we have and just combine those obligations in a way that we can direct them towards the Central Arctic Ocean. And there is actually precedent here. There's a fisheries agreement in this space known as CAUFA, or the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which counts among its parties Russia, the United States, China, and the EU, so slightly unlikely partners who've agreed to at least a 16-year pause on any commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean until they can at least determine some conservation sustainability standards. And that too was done in a precautionary way. So those are some of the things that give us hope. We hope to build on that model, be even more inclusive, bring in the voices of large ocean states and indigenous peoples in the Arctic and elsewhere who will be impacted, and build a coalition towards protection. Something else that gives us hope and guidance is, of course, the BBNJ Agreement. We're members of the High Seas Alliance, and so we're thrilled to see that major development, and we're hopeful that COP1 early next year will go well. That said, at the moment, the BBNJ and its marine protected area route isn't really the best fit for everywhere in the ocean. So the Central Arctic Ocean specifically, given the tense geopolitics of being located between the United States and Russia, long-term protection is a non-starter for most states. It is an immediate no. And we have such a unique opportunity to protect in a short period of time before commercial activity starts, before we do more harm to those species locally, that we have to work in a reasonable way. And for many states, 10 years is an acceptable amount that helps set a benchmark for future protection. And it's not that we don't want permanent protection. This is sort of step one in getting us there. So that's why we are very supportive of the BBNJ, but not necessarily pursuing the marine protected area route for the moment. There's also other tools in international law and other developments that give us hope, and Michelle mentioned those, and those are the advisory opinions. For anyone that's unfamiliar, an advisory opinion is, in simplest terms, a clarification from an international court about a legal question that it was asked. And so far, there have been 3 around climate change. There's a 4th one upcoming. The first one of those was the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. The question was the most oceans-connected advisory opinion that we've had. And effectively, it was determined that despite the fact that climate change wasn't really a part of the international vocabulary when the Convention on the Law of the Sea was being negotiated, states have an obligation to prevent pollution in the marine environment, and that obligation extends to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, states do have climate change obligations linked to the ocean. The Inter-American Court, which Michelle talked about, which is maybe my favorite opinion of all 3, as well as the International Court of Justice, also concluded that states do have obligations around climate change far beyond Paris and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the International Court also clarified that states can be held responsible for failing to meet these obligations. They could be held responsible for reparations. And that part is actually quite consequential when you're trying to talk to delegations or technical experts who are not used to considering climate or the environment or the oceans in part of the negotiations that they're having. And one of those spaces in which we've been able to introduce the advisory opinions and use a development in international law in practice is surprisingly the International Maritime Organization. Although shipping obviously has daily encounters with marine biodiversity and accounts for a really large percentage of global emissions, sometimes the delegates there can see themselves as removed from global climate conversations. So I'm going to walk you through a sort of case study of how we've been able to use the advisory opinions and hope that that serves as inspiration or guidance for how it can be introduced into other ways. And that's through our partners at the Clean Arctic Alliance. So this February, culminating with multiple years of work, the Clean Arctic Alliance was trying to argue for reductions in black carbon emissions in the Arctic. Many of you will have heard of black carbon in the form of soot. It is a super pollutant. It has a warming potential way larger than just carbon dioxide, although it stays in the atmosphere for less time. And most of the fuels that are used in the Arctic are heavy fuel. Despite there being regulation around it, it doesn't go far enough. And that means that there's a lot of soot being emitted onto pristine, ice-covered, white areas in the Arctic. And obviously soot is quite dark, so it has a lot of negative impacts there. And so the role that Global Choices plays and the role that the advisory opinions can play is to provide legal backing towards protection where there's a lot of scientific or technical guidance already existing. So what we did is we looked at all 3 advisory opinions to find duties and obligations and help make the argument that protecting the Arctic in this way, so reducing black carbon emissions, can help guide states in the right direction towards meeting their obligations. And also illustrate that there are consequences for failing to do so. So I don't think I have time to walk you through what we did. Happy to sidebar with anyone. But in the paper that we submitted, we focused on states' duty not to cause significant harm, their obligation to protect the marine environment from pollution, the fact that the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a precursor or necessary for the enjoyment of all other human rights, which has a lot of bearing in the Arctic given the health impacts of black carbon. And also that the agreed temperature threshold of the Paris Agreement was 1.5 degrees Celsius and not 2 degrees Celsius. And that has a lot to do with the fact that black carbon is a super pollutant. And so we were able to submit papers, introduce the advisory opinions to IMO discourse, which hasn't happened before, speak in plenaries, and we actually had a very positive response. And hopefully at next year's Pollution Prevention and Response Committee, there will be concrete work towards black carbon. We've done it in terms of decarbonization, and there's a lot of opportunity for civil society to step in and help interpret the advisory opinions beyond the traditional fossil fuel emissions space that they tend to be confined in. And of course, none of that would be possible without the leadership of students and the large ocean states. So it's been a very intergenerational and climate just focused mission to get these advisory opinions out there, and fingers crossed for a positive one from the African Court of Peoples and Human Rights. I know I've gone on a little bit of a journey and talked about 2 distinct case studies, but I'd say if there's anything to take away from this, it's one, that the Arctic is a crucial part of oceans conversations, and just because it's frozen, it shouldn't be left out. And second, that there are a lot of creative opportunities beyond the sort of really long-lasting multilateral treaty negotiations processes for us to get stuck in and help make an impact. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Fascinating insights and ideas and inspirations. There've been a number of questions that have been put in the Q&A. If anyone wants to put up their hand, please do so. But I'm going to go ahead with the one unanswered question. And I'm going to put that, I think, to Sue. It's from Elsa Cabrera. And I'll just read it out. I would suggest to everyone else to look also at the answered questions which the panelists have answered in the meantime. And then if anyone's got any more, please feel free to speak up. So this question to you, Sue, given the current geopolitical landscape where serious international crimes such as crimes against humanity and war crimes often go unpunished, what are the prospects of the ecocide movement to keep gaining legal and political traction? It's a very question and very valid. How might the movement overcome the same structural obstacles? And I'll leave the rest, but I know that this is an issue that people will be thinking, so it's worth mentioning now because we've got to keep going.
Absolutely. Yes, and it's a very pertinent question. I think what's happening at the moment is we're not seeing any slowdown in enthusiasm for ecocide law. We're seeing a disregard of the rule of law by a number of big players, powerful players. But what we're seeing at the same time is a coming together of other states to say, actually, we need to protect the rule of law and we need to do things ourselves, perhaps away from the big powers. So what we've seen is the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty meeting, which is happening later this month in Santa Marta, which is taking it out of the COPs, the UNFCCC COPs, which have become overrun with oil lobbyists, and to say, actually, look, we're serious about this. Let's talk about it. And I think 80-odd states are now signed up to go. So what we're seeing is a sort of a different level of activity and movement, and perhaps a more engaged one from those who are serious about doing it. From our point of view, we are everything's still going on at the International Criminal Court. Obviously, it's been sanctioned by the United States for issuing an arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. And so its activities are slightly curtailed at the moment. Things are slowing down, but things are still going on. The working group on amendments is still meeting. Ecocide law is still on the agenda. But we know that might be a bit slower until things have settled down geopolitically. What we are seeing now, though, is a real big uptake of interest at the national level. And I think I reeled off a load of states who have got ecocide bills going through. There are many more, some that aren't quite ready. They're just getting ready to go. Some that have been through Parliament and failed for one reason or another, like Parliament was dissolved or it didn't quite get through. So, but that have had a first run at it, but are getting ready for their second run at it because they don't always go through first time. So there's a lot that's going on, and I really do think that a lot of countries are saying we need to take responsibility now. And so I feel terribly encouraged by that. And I'm seeing that happen in the business community as well, which I also work with. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it's really for the audience. Guillermo, you want to say something?
Thank you very much. I just want to, looking at the 3 answered questions, there's a question from Hugo Echeverria to Michelle, and he was asking how Michelle thought about the recognition of ocean rights within existing treaties and fisheries management in the high seas, so RFMOs and BBNJ and whatnot. And Michelle, I think she pointed to something that is, to her presentation, a structural issue with the frameworks that we've designed. And she talks about these as anthropocentric frameworks. And I just wanted to give you an example of just how anthropocentric these frameworks are. And I'm a believer in the UN, multilateralism, the law of the sea. So I'm not shooting it down in any way, but in parallel, I was opening the Law of the Sea Convention, or the Constitution for the Ocean, right? And in Article 62.2 on utilization of living resources, it says the following: the coastal state shall determine its capacity to harvest the living resources of the exclusive economic zone, period. Where the coastal state does not have the capacity to harvest the entire allowable catch, when you can't catch as much as you can, it shall, not may, but it shall, through agreements or other arrangements and pursuant to the terms, conditions, laws, and regulation, give other states access to the quote-unquote surplus of the allowable catch. So there's just this extractive sort of spirit baked even into the Law of the Sea Convention that is so important to us. To, if you can't catch the maximum sustainable yield, you can't reach the maximum catch, you shall give others the right to come in and take it. And I think that's deeply problematic. And again, we have all this architecture and all these bodies, and I've got good friends who are fisheries managers, but I showed you in that graph, global overfishing is on the rise, despite our smarts and bodies and treaties. So I think there's a structural issue that a biologist cannot answer, but about the legal text and how it was described, that we shall give others access to make sure we catch as much as we can. That is part of the wicked issue that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Guillermo, for that qualification as well. So I'm going to step back and just say, big picture. We've all sat here, listened to some amazing ideas that are exciting and inspiring. So what's the next step? People here are listening. What approaches, what collaborative approaches could you think of could be used to take these ideas forward? What would each of you suggest? What would you be looking for? How can you be supported? So I'm actually going to do a quick round robin. I'm going to basically on my screen and ask each of you, what would you be looking for? What would your dream request be? So Michelle, I'm going to start with you first.
Well, that's a good one. I mean, at the highest level, and I actually mentioned this in the response that Guillermo pointed to, is something that we're aiming for is a universal declaration of ocean rights or similar by 2030. We want a new norm for ocean governance and state support to do that. Obviously, that requires resources and support, but something we're building within the Ocean Rights website and hub is building an inclusive movement to ensure that stakeholders around the world can feel like they are not only can be effective advocates on behalf of the movement, but that they can inform it. Because we're looking, when we talk about international law, we're also talking about doing it differently than what's been done before, which has been very state-centric, colonial, anthropocentric. It has marginalized those diverse worldviews of indigenous peoples, coastal communities, right? Nature itself. So we want to do it different and learn from others how we can do it different and really embrace local community knowledge, context, cultural worldviews, and not have it just be the same old business as usual. So for folks that are interested in being involved, providing input, something we're undertaking is like soon this year is a consultation, ocean rights consultation, to inform what rights does the ocean have? What does this mean? And how could we create an international law that can embrace legal pluralism, so that we're not just promoting, like I said, the same Western legal construct of rights, but can we embrace different ways of an ethical relationship? You know, what other language other than rights, you know, resonates with folks around the world? So I encourage folks to reach out in that capacity because it's something that I truly believe in, that this movement needs to be inclusive and bottom up rather than being imposed top down as the usual international law typically goes.
Love it. Thanks so much, Michelle. Right, next on my screen, Sue.
Okay. So when people hear about ecocide law, the vast majority of them go, oh, wow, I've never heard of it. A lot of them say I've never heard of it still. But how amazing. And why don't we have it already? And the reason is that not enough people know about it. And so we very much need to get that word socialized and out there. We need people talking about ecocide and pointing out ecocide. So that's the first thing, and that's something everybody can do. And it's only when we're in the same way that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We can lead politicians right up the aisle. But if they're not hearing it from the people, we're not going to get them to sign it. So whilst they're very interested, they're listening to us and they're getting it through their legislatures, we're not going to get the votes we need until they're hearing the people say, this is something we want. So we need to be amplifying the ecocide message. One of our allies, or a couple of our allies together, a couple of years ago, I think one of them might be in the audience, did a collaboration on an Ipsos poll across G20 countries, and the result was that 72% of those questioned would support an ecocide law. But having heard about it, so that was across a lot of a lot of countries and a very wide range. So there is an appetite there for it if people know about it. And in the same way, although it's a very diplomatic sort of, it has to be finalized by the politicians, actually it needs to be a bottom-up movement as well.
So both bottom-up movements, or at least reaching down to the top from the bottom up as well. It really helps. So everyone out there, talk about these things. Vedika, you're next.
I think I'm definitely going to build on what both Sue and Michelle said, and that's helped me realize that I forgot to clarify what an Arctic Angel is, which I was kindly introduced as Antoinette by. I am an Arctic Angel, which is a network that Global Choices runs of young women climate activists from around the world who are united in advocating for the ice crisis. And so there's 74 of us now in nearly 40 countries, and we come from really, really different backgrounds. I mean, I'm a sort of policy person. We have one of our Arctic Angels in Canada is the founder of a zero emissions shipping company. We've got scientists, we've got entrepreneurs, and it really helps to demonstrate exactly what Sue was saying, that this is an issue of importance, that the Arctic Ocean and systems level change in the oceans matters to people. And you will have politicians respond differently when someone from their own country or someone from a region that they think of as distant from the Arctic is standing up and advocating for it. So if you are a young woman climate activist, check out Arctic Angels. Otherwise, we absolutely do need all help we can get in raising awareness, and you can join something on our website called the Arctic Ice Force, or you could sign our petition. And yes, our high-level dream, of course, is not only to have the Central Arctic Ocean moratorium realized, but also to have it be a model for systems-based protection in other vulnerable regions around the world. So anything that helps us move the needle there is fantastic.
Thanks so much, Vedika. Also very important. And also we should put all the links to our various things on the recording at the end. Guillermo, last but not least, definitely not least.
Thank you, Antoinette. I had my phone here, and I just wanted to read out to you the background that I've had on my phone for the last 3 years. The screensaver says, people who say it's impossible should not interrupt those who are trying to make it possible. Whether it's ecocide law, rights of nature, or the Central Arctic Ocean. I think it sometimes takes one person who will be called crazy and many other names to start something that is much needed. Than now, for instance, like the moratorium of international whaling or women's suffrage. Those who started those movements were called crazy, and now it's obvious. It was so obvious from the start, but starting a paradigm shift takes courage. But it only takes one person to say, you know what, I believe in this. And I'm really grateful to have shared a panel with 3 women who have a vision for what the future of ocean law and diplomacy could look like. So we still have 51 people on the call, 51 potential change makers to carry a vision forward, carry a message, and just my message would be whatever you think is the change that we need, from surface level and local to deep ocean governance, systemic change. Just keep fighting. If you are on the right track, you will have pushback. I work on fisheries in the high seas. It's a long journey, but you have to keep pushing. And like Vedika said, sometimes I believe again in multilateralism. BBNJ has been a slow burn for 24 years. Multilateralism is great, and we should keep fighting for it. But sometimes it takes one country just saying, you know what, as we negotiate all these things, that's all well and good, but I'm going to start by saying any vessel flying my flag or any national or any corporation in my country shall not do this, and lead by example. Is that going to save the ocean? No, but I suspect that a second country would say, you know what, screw it, me too. No one who's a national flying my flag will do this. And that's when you get the snowball effect maybe starting. So look for inspiration from my fellow panelists. They're fighting for what in hopefully not too many years will be like ecocide law, rights of nature. Like how did we not do this before? How did we not close the Central Arctic Ocean before? So dream big, expect pushback, and if you need help, this is your emotional support group right here on the screen.
Thanks so much. I think at the end, listening to everyone, it's up, down, left, right. It really is everything, everywhere, all at once. And that's why getting all sorts of groups involved, and even strange groups, Sue, with business and faith and actors and everyone supporting these things, everyone has a superpower. And we've just got to tap into all those superpowers. You've all got superpowers, and everyone listening does. It's just trying to bring them all together. So I think on that note, I am going to wrap up, and thank you all for your wonderful, inspirational ideas. And I hope that in a few years' time, we're celebrating their achievement, and I think it's achievable. So thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.